Thanks a lot for coming to our discussion forum today in this wonderful gallery at Goethe Institute in Washington. It is becoming almost a pre-holiday tradition by now that for 4 years in a row our organization, Azerbaijani Americans for Democracy, is holding such events right before holidays at this time of the year. So we like to think about it as our special type of Christmas card or holiday greetings to the Azerbaijani government. Because December 24th is not just Christmas Eve, it's also President Ilham Aliyev's birthday. But on a more serious and unfortunately on a more somber note, we're meeting today at a time when the accelerating crackdown on dissent in Azerbaijan has reached the scale of a total war. It is a war that's waged by the ruling regime on civil society. Just the small fact that a country of 9 million people has over 100 prisoners, that's more than the rest of the former Soviet Union combined, speaks for itself. Any activist leader, any civil society leader with whom many of you might have interacted and with whom US or European organizations might have worked to promote democracy in Azerbaijan is either in jail or is probably being targeted to be put behind bars right now. And it's also interesting how it got to this point, because it didn't happen suddenly, it happened over many years. And over many years, there were a lot of criticism in the media, expressions of concern by Azerbaijan's Western partners, and sometimes even verbal rebukes from other countries and their governments towards Azerbaijani leadership. But this policy of engagement, as it is called, seems to be falling on deaf ears in Baku, because the situation is definitely getting worse on all fundamental freedoms. So today we will focus not just on how bad the situation is, we probably know that already, we hear a lot about it, but specifically we want to focus on what the United States can do in terms of robust, tangible pressure, including sanctions, and can that maybe help to change dynamics. And we have two very distinguished speakers today who possess definitely rich experience, expert insights, and who have been outspoken about this matter in the past, about the state of human rights and democracy in Azerbaijan, and not just in Azerbaijan. So our first panelist today is Ambassador Richard Kauzlarich. Currently, Ambassador Kauzlarich is the co-director of the Center for Energy Science and Policy, and also an adjunct professor of School of Policy, Government and International Affairs at George Mason University. In the 1990s, he served as US Ambassador to Azerbaijan and went to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And he also served as an officer for Europe on the National Intelligence Council from 2003 to 2011. Our second speaker is Mr. David Kramer, who just started with the McCain Institute as Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy. So congratulations, David, for your new job. And most recently, he worked as the President of Freedom House, and he also served 8 years at the US Department of State, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. So both Rich and David have spoken many times about the state of affairs with rights and democracy in Azerbaijan, and most recently they co-authored an article in the American Interest magazine, whose title, surprisingly, is very similar to the title of today's event, Time for Sanctions on Baku. So the questions that we want to discuss are, can sanctions and other similar measures of pressure finally make the Azerbaijani officials stop and think and maybe imposing some tangible consequences to their actions can change the way the things are. And can we save Azerbaijani civil society from total repression and provide very much needed breathing room for those who still want to continue the hard work of promoting democracy? As an organization, we at AZAD certainly think so, that the time has come for taking a much tougher line towards Baku. Gorkhmaz will speak after our guest speakers and in more detail about our position, but most importantly today we want to hear from our distinguished speakers and also from all of you during Q&A section as well. And before I hand the floor to Ambassador Kauzlarich, I also want to announce a very pleasant addition to our events agenda. We had a renowned photographer from Netherlands, Ed Nuis, who kindly shared with us his video work called Oil and Paradise, which we will demo for you at the end of the event, after the Q&A section. That video is a result of 10 trips to Azerbaijan over 5 years, where he took a lot of photographs and videos, artistically illustrating different sides of life in an oil dictatorship. So if you would like to see this wonderful work, please stick around for the video after the Q&A section. Thank you, and I'll hand the floor to Ambassador Kauzlarich.
Good afternoon. First, let me thank Elmar Chakhtakhtinski, who has a last name that rivals mine in terms of an Anglo-Saxon tongue getting wrapped around in the most unpleasant ways. But Elmar, thank you for including me once again on your Christmas card list.
My name also has Polish in.
Oh, well, that should help. My Croatian grandfather would be very proud. But this is a group that I really welcome the opportunity to visit with because it is a chance to talk about some of the issues that really don't get discussed anywhere else. So for that, I applaud you, and your willingness to hear different views is very welcome. David Kramer and I are unindicted co-conspirators on Azerbaijan, both within the government and outside, but I just want to say David and his work at Freedom House and elsewhere is someone who I think has made a name for the U.S. human rights community. And I thank you for the work that you've done and that you're doing now at the McCain Institute, so it's good to see you. My purpose for being here, though, is really simple. I want to press for the release of Hajia Ismailova, Leyla and Arif Yunus, and the more than 90 political prisoners that we held in Azerbaijan. That really has to be, whatever else we are thinking these days about Azerbaijan, that has to be our focus. And that's why I'm going to say what I want to say. Because the objective should be, how do we get these poor people out of the horrible conditions they are? Free citizens of Azerbaijan. Another question that people increasingly ask me, and maybe it's because I've been almost 2 decades now away from Azerbaijan, is, what business is it of yours, Rich Kauzlarich, to even be thinking about, let alone talking about what's going on in Azerbaijan today? I spent a lot of time while I was ambassador there on behalf of human rights, freedom of expression, and democracy movement. So it kind of gets in your blood. I thought it was important, and it still is. I'm also concerned about the direction that U.S.-Azerbaijani relations are taking, especially, and I'll talk about this a little later on, after Ramiz Mektiev's December 3 document. And then finally, I think it's important to have people speak out, be the voice for those who can't speak out for themselves. I shouldn't be here. And this meeting should not be taking place in Washington, it should be taking place in Baku. Elmar mentioned the fact that things have regressed in Azerbaijan. And I saw an interesting quote the other day attributed to the American novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he said one should be able to see that things are hopeless, yet be determined to make them otherwise. And I think things are getting pretty hopeless in Azerbaijan. We're seeing the impact of conflicting global trends where you have simultaneously moves toward both liberal and illiberal democracy. You have the simultaneous explosion of information and access to it, as well as efforts to restrict and control that access. You have the unprecedented ability of people to travel around the world, and yet governments try to keep people from travel. And last, and for someone who's just turned 70, a very important point, you've got this simultaneous embrace of a youth culture, yet accompanied with a profound fear of what youth might do if they had the opportunity. I look back on my over 20 years now of being involved with Azerbaijan, and the one thing that really strikes me is the difference that oil and gas have made to Azerbaijan. $98 million worth of income in a very short period of time. And yet behind what, to me at least, appears in Baku today as being a Dubai-like facade, you have social unrest brewing because of the corruption associated with that money. And in a very strange way, Islamic radicalization on the increase rather than decrease. I take the point of departure in terms of where Azerbaijan has been moving, actually the 2013 presidential election period. And that began the process of eliminating any political opposition, of suppressing free speech, of either expelling or closing U.S. NGOs, most recently the Peace Corps, which I find a very unsettling thing, and the growing anti-Western rhetoric that we hear more and more from official Azerbaijan. My sense is, talking to people who've been there recently, is that Azerbaijan has become a society of fear. Fear where the leadership fears its own people, especially young people, and where people are fearful of the leadership and the institutions associated with it. But something else has changed, and that's the nature of the U.S.-Azerbaijan relationship. Despite differences over the years, Azerbaijan was willing to work with the United States, and that resulted in some pretty profound successes. It enabled Azerbaijan's prosperity. It allowed Azerbaijan to continue as a sovereign and independent state. It provided both a political and commercial framework for energy. It led to the cooperation between our two countries in Afghanistan. And even despite the limits placed on the United States assistance program, we were able to work with non-government organizations to advance democracy, freedom of expression, and human rights. And yet, despite this success, in the background was a growing official Azerbaijan unease, a sense that the United States simply was not, to use an expression of the day, showing enough love to Azerbaijan. And that after embracing initial NGO activity in Azerbaijan, now the NGOs were seen as a threat to the regime's hold on power, either directly to activities of organizations like NDI and IRI, working with political parties, or indirectly to activities that funded local NGOs and their representatives. Azerbaijan was faced with an opportunity last fall, connected with the Vilnius summit, to follow Ukraine and Georgia, maybe not directly, but follow that path toward the EU. But I think official Azerbaijan recognized that if the government did that, they would open themselves up to even more criticism on human rights and democracy building grounds. I just saw, thanks to David, the Washington Post op-ed or editorial piece today, and I was very, very glad that they made the same point that I was going to make about Ramiz Mekdiyev's December 3 polemic. In my 20 years, I've never seen a document from anyone in the government of Azerbaijan, a public document that even resembles this. It is essentially a declaration that the Hayder Aliyev period, the period of cooperation, is over. I'm not sure what we're beginning, but this document positions Ramiz Mekteyev as the most important political figure in Azerbaijan. It becomes, I think, an ideological framework that changes the course of Azerbaijan's relations with the United States and with the West. I'm not sure we're going to hear anytime soon much talk about strategic partnerships with the United States if a document like this accuses us of creating fifth columns. And we all, if we have any knowledge of history, know what that means. Fifth columns within Azerbaijan by our, and trying to accomplish regime change. And the paper clearly identifies the U.S., U.S. NGOs, and those Azerbaijani traders who work with us as being now responsible for the situation that this long document addresses. I think another unprecedented part of this is the direct attack on President Obama. Again, I'm not seeing anything in my experience that would even come close to that. So, what's to be done? That's kind of what we're here about. And I think had this meeting took place 2 weeks ago, I would have written a different conclusion. But I think that this Ramiz piece really brings up the profound need for the United States to rethink how do we engage with the people of Azerbaijan. The traditional methods that we developed over the period of post-independence history no longer are available, either by choice of the organizations because they can't operate there or because the government is, the Azerbaijani government has shut them down. I don't have an answer for that question, but I think a meeting like this provides an opportunity to talk about it. I think especially post-December 3, the United States has to rethink what kind of relationship we in fact do want to have with Azerbaijan. I said that I don't believe a strategic partnership makes much sense in this environment, but can we have a normal diplomatic relationship, however you want to describe that, with Azerbaijan? The third point, and this came up even before the Mekteyev piece, people would say to me, we're overdoing it on democracy and human rights. Shouldn't we abandon support for democracy, human rights, and freedom of expression on the grounds that the current government isn't going to pay any attention to us anyway, and it may endanger other U.S. interests. It also gives the regime a basis for taking even more extreme steps in terms of internal suppression. But I think if we decide to stay true to our values and continue to support the release of people like Haji Al-Layla, Arif, and the others, then we need to think what we should do in pursuit of that. We need to stay with our European friends and make sure this is a Western effort both to press diplomatically and in public statements for the release of the political prisoners. We need to make clear to the government in Baku about the expectations for behavior consistent with the international obligations that Azerbaijan undertook of its own free will in terms of the Council of Europe and the United Nations. If this does not work, then I think it is time to consider what David and I suggested and what others are talking about. And that is sanctions that show to the government that there are consequences that go with the continued violation of human rights in Azerbaijan. The Magnitsky Act is a precedent. I just saw in the last 2 days, others of you may be aware of this, but this Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act that was passed by the Senate, different context. but it shows that people are thinking about how the U.S. can influence behavior in terms of human rights. My favorite suggestion is a travel warning to American citizens going to Azerbaijan. I think we should tell American citizens that they risk being surveilled, having their activities monitored, having their hotel room bugged and have videos taken of whatever they're doing in their hotel room. That I think they should be going to Azerbaijan, recognizing that despite the glitzy films promoting tourism in Azerbaijan, there are really bad things that can happen to you. And then ultimately, whatever we do, I think we have to try to coordinate with our European friends. I know that's going to be hard, but there are people in Europe who are as concerned as people in this room about doing something to free Haji Alela, Arif, and the others. Ultimately, in my most unanswered part of my question, I guess, is will this work? And will it do more harm than good? Because ultimately I worry about what happens to the people who are in prison now. So I think I'll just stop there and let David make the course corrections. But we really do want to hear from you about your thoughts as well.
Thanks very much, Rich, and to Elmar and Gorkhmaz, thanks very much for inviting me to join you here today. This is not my first time with you at one of these events, and it's a great pleasure. And also to see so many people more knowledgeable and expert about Azerbaijan than I am here in this room. So as Rich said, we very much look forward to having a discussion here, or questions, but some of you may have better answers than Rich and I do. This morning in the Washington Post, I wrote a piece pushing back on an article that appeared a few days ago by Michael Hanlon and Jeremy Shapiro about this idea of a win-win-win for Ukraine, Russia, and the West, which I thought was frankly nonsense. At the end of the piece, I argued one of the best ways to deal with the challenge we face from Russia today is to help Russia's neighbors, to bolster them, to become more integrated into the West, move in a more liberal, democratic direction. Left out of the piece because of space constraints, I said supporting Russia's neighbors consistent with our principles. And this is where I think we run into a problem with the current government in Azerbaijan, where developments in Azerbaijan have certainly not been consistent with universal principles, not just Western principles, universal principles that Azerbaijan has signed up to abide by, and it has been violating, particularly in the past year. But going back to the election of last year, developments just in the past few weeks have been, I think, especially egregious. I don't think any of us in this room wants to have bad relations between Azerbaijan and the West. Everyone understands that having a good relationship, whether it's US-Azerbaijan or Azerbaijan with other countries in Europe, is in everyone's interest. But it's hard to develop good relations with a regime that is increasingly corrupt and increasingly authoritarian. Those are the regimes that we in the West have problems with. And Azerbaijan is becoming a problem, as Rich mentioned, particularly in light of the Ramiz Mekdiev manifesto that was issued earlier this month. The situation, as I say, has gotten significantly worse. Political prisoners now, I realize there's some debate about the count, but I think it's safe to say now over 100, which was mentioned, is double what Belarus and Russia have. And yet we have sanctions against both the Lukashenko and the Putin regimes for human rights abuses, and we don't have anything in place to do with the Aliyev regime. So I think that in itself means we have to be more consistent with our principles. Khadija Ismailova's arrest and detention now for at least 2 months is the latest outrage that's occurred. And I think it was the issue that prompted the Washington Post today to issue its editorial, which I think was a great editorial. Bringing more attention to the situation, I think, is the challenge that we all face in this room. People who are here today know what's happening, again, better than I do. But it's people outside of this room who need to be educated about what's happening in Azerbaijan. Because all Azerbaijan is known for, among those who can find it on a map right now, is oil. Some people know it's important for security interests. But we need to make it clear to people that Azerbaijan also matters because it is moving in an increasingly corrupt authoritarian direction that is threatening its own people, but also threatening the region in everything that we stand for. The health of Leyla Yunus, her husband Ramiz, we're also very fortunate to have his brother here today, is a great concern. And that's why I think, as Rich mentioned, pressing for the release and also full political rehabilitation of people who have been arrested and imprisoned is absolutely vital. It is reaching a point now of life and death. And so we cannot let up in our pressure to secure the release of these individuals who have done nothing wrong. That's the point. They have done nothing wrong other than try to push for greater respect for human rights in their country, even reconciliation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. What's wrong with that? That's desperately needed. The Mekti of Screed had an Orwellian title, at least the title I saw, the world order of double standards and modern Azerbaijan. If I can read my picture. Yes. And Rich already has talked about this. Description of NGOs as a fifth column. The outside funding of NGOs is part of a plot to overthrow the current government in Baku, just as they accuse the West of overthrowing the Yanukovych regime. All this, of course, as we all know in this room, is sheer nonsense. And yet this is what they resort to in order to try to explain and justify the abuses that they engage in on a daily basis. The Mekti have singled out Khadija by name for anti-state activities and blackening the image of her country. And she, of course, was arrested the next day. No coincidence. We sometimes wonder why. Why is the government doing this now? It's interesting speculation. People wonder why Putin has cracked down, in particular, for almost the past 3 years after returning to the presidency. People cite the upcoming Euro Olympics. They cite the fear of what happened in Ukraine. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's what's happening on the ground. It's interesting. I don't want to be totally dismissive. It's interesting to speculate why, because perhaps we can understand more the roots of what's happening and why. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It's what's happening to people on the ground in Azerbaijan that is the most pressing concern. The Post editorial today was excellent, as I said. It ended on, I have to say though, a slightly disappointing note. It said Azerbaijan has courted the West with its energy riches and took pride in being host of the Eurovision Song Contest in 2012, but all is not well along the coast of the Caspian Sea. Mr. Aliyev is not only crushing individual lives, but trying to imprison the very concept of freedom itself. He should be reminded by the United States and by Europe that this grim ambition won't succeed and will only hurt his country. The reason I was a little disappointed is I would have liked a little more specifics on how to remind him that this is not how to behave and treat his own people. And that's where I think we get into the issue of what do we do. There have been statements issued recently, particularly after Khadija's arrest, expressing concern. I welcome all the statements, but I think we're past the time of expressing concerns or wringing our hands, and it's time to figure out what do we do about it. I agree completely with Rich on the importance of unity with the EU, but I also firmly believe in the importance of U.S. leadership on these issues. And I think if the U.S. does not show an inclination to act in light of the gross abuses being committed in Azerbaijan, it is incredibly unlikely that Europe will take the lead on its own. We've already seen, by the way, in Hungary, that the U.S. has denied visas to, I think, close to a dozen Hungarian officials. The situation in Hungary is actually a real cause of concern to me, but the situation in Azerbaijan is significantly worse than it is in Hungary. And it seems to me the U.S. acted alone in Hungary. We should be taking steps on Azerbaijan. We, as Rich mentioned, we argued for Magnitsky-like sanctions. As has been pointed out to me, the president already has authority to deny entry or deny visas to officials who engage in serious human rights abuses through a proclamation he issued in August 2011. President Bush had similar authority that he exercised in the case of Belarus. It seems to me that legislation isn't absolutely required. It's the political will to move ahead and take steps that will get the attention to answer the post's plea at the end that the current behavior is unacceptable. Travel advisories, I agree with Rich, particularly with Saeed here, about the experience he had and others. Very important to do so that people think that it's not just a paradise. There are risks to traveling there and just being a regular visitor. The other issue I would raise is the Euro Olympics. And here I think we should be doing something, and maybe we're going to be alone and not standing with Europe, though I would obviously hope that the Europeans would be with us. In 2012, Azerbaijan was awarded the opportunity to host the first Euro Olympics. And President Aliyev had this statement on December 10th, 2012, after the decision by the European Olympic Committee to grant this honor on Azerbaijan. And he said, this is going to be hard for me to read because it's really small print. A role has been played by our country's international authority. Azerbaijan is a country enjoying tremendous international respect these days. Our role and influence in the international community are growing, and the world community treats Azerbaijan with great respect and reverence. He goes on to say, in other words, our international relations are expanding, the number of our friends is growing, the international authority of our country is very positive. Another factor is that there has been public and political stability in Azerbaijan for many years. This is also very important. Public and political stability is highly important to the country's dynamic and successful development. Azerbaijan has asserted itself in the world as an exemplary country in this respect. Then lastly, toward the end, I want to repeat that the decision to award the first European Olympic Games to Baku is a historic event. It is evidence of great confidence in us, a sign of great respect, but it also means tremendous responsibility. I have no doubt that we will cope with this test successfully and with dignity and conduct the Games at a high level. I congratulate all the people of Azerbaijan on this wonderful occasion. Well, obviously he doesn't congratulate the more than 100 people sitting in jail for political reasons. This suggests to me that these Olympics matter enormously to President Aliyev. And it suggests to me we need to focus on these games. It may be very difficult to press for a relocation of these games. There was talk about this, if you remember, with the Sochi Olympics, which is a much larger event because it's international, not limited to Europe. But it seems to me at a minimum we should be taking the approach of urging all European political leaders to stay away from these games, as most did, not all, as most did at the Sochi Games earlier this year in February. And denying Aliyev the opportunity to stand on the center stage with political leaders, I think would be a blow to his image, to everything he just, I just read that he was talking about back in 2012. Aliyev loves hosting events, Eurovision, Internet Governance Forum. These are all part of his efforts to build up the image of Azerbaijan. And why international organizations keep allowing Azerbaijan to host these events is a mystery to me. I think we can speculate. I think I just heard an answer. And so revisiting these decisions, putting these organizations under a microscope to figure out how it is they make these decisions. And it isn't just Azerbaijan, let's be clear. FIFA is another organization that's worth taking a look at. And the International Olympic Committee, not just the European Olympic Committee, is another. But these kinds of events, I think, mean a lot to Aliyev. And if they mean a lot to Aliyev, then we should be demanding a lot more from him in exchange for hosting these events. And if he doesn't deliver, then we shouldn't deliver. We should demand that these things change. Lastly, this is, I would argue, a war about freedom and democracy and human rights, and I do use the word war because of what Russia is up to. It's not just an information war. It is a military war. It is a political war. It's an economic war. It is a war across the scale. And what we are supposed to be standing for, we, the United States, our European, Canadian, Australian, and Japanese allies, is standing for our principles. This comes back to the first point I was making, about supporting Russia's neighbors consistent with our principles, with what we stand for. There will be those who argue, why punish the government in Baku now in light of what Russia's up to? This will push the Aliyev regime into the hands of the Russians. I don't want them joining us if we see how they're treating their own people. They will corrupt us. They will corrupt our systems. They already are. The Council of Europe and other institutions. And so here again, we have to stay firm with our principles. Support countries that want to move to the West, but have them understand that in doing so, it is encumbered with certain obligations and abiding by norms and standards that we do not take for granted. So when we say something's unacceptable, as I think we all agree the arrests of all these people have been unacceptable, what are we going to do about it so as not to accept it? Are we just going to say the word unacceptable and then return to business as usual? Or are we going to say something's unacceptable and then do something about it? Last point, and I apologize for going on. Rich made a very important point. Who are we to criticize? And particularly this week, perhaps, people will say, look at the report that came out about your CIA. What right do you have? What chutzpah do you have to be criticizing others? There is great controversy about the issuance of the report. At the end of the day, though, whether one supports it or not, I think it speaks very highly of the United States in terms of the ability to look at ourselves and try to learn from mistakes that we've made in the past and make sure they're not repeated. Azerbaijan, the government there, does not do that. And so it is a sign of strength, I think, that democracies can learn from their mistakes, make sure they don't repeat them. And I use the word mistakes carefully because some of these people were in positions that I don't think any of us would have wanted to have been in. But let's be clear, the problems that we may have pale in comparison to corrupt authoritarian regimes around the world, not just in Azerbaijan. And just because we have problems and shortcomings and weaknesses doesn't mean that we abandon the agenda of promoting freedom and human rights around the world. It means that we have to make ourselves a better system while simultaneously pressing for greater democracy and human rights elsewhere. Thanks very much.
I want to thank the esteemed speakers for sharing their valuable thoughts with us today. I hope the question and answer session will be equally interesting. with the discussion focused on what can be done to influence the current situation with the Azerbaijani government. Several days before this event, I was having a discussion with Jamil Hassanli, the Azerbaijani opposition candidate during the last presidential elections of 2013. He was on a brief visit to DC, and being a prominent historian of the Caucasus, he told me a story which appears to be relevant to today's discussion. In early 19th century, as Russia conquered the Caucasus, several Azerbaijani Khanates agreed to be part of Russia through treaties to avoid war and destruction. In 1805, the Khan of Karabakh, Ibrahim Khan, concluded a treaty with Russia, and the Russian Empire awarded him the rank of the Lieutenant General of the Russian Army just to keep him subordinate. Several months later, dissatisfied with some developments in that Khanate, the Russian Emperor issued a formal reprimand to the Khan. The Russian viceroy to the Caucasus is tasked to deliver this reprimand to Ibrahim Khan, and he arrives to Karabakh with this diplomatic mission. Ibrahim Khan arranges a lavish welcome party for the Russian viceroy, who sits puzzled at the dinner party, not knowing how to break the news to Khan. As Ibrahim Khan asks why the Russian viceroy looks unhappy, the Russian official tells Khan something bad has happened. What? The emperor issued a reprimand to you. What is reprimand? Asks Khan, who apparently was unfamiliar with the concept of reprimand. Well, it means bad, it's very bad. How bad? Will it do any harm to my cattle or to my horses? No, says Russian viceroy. Well, then don't worry and enjoy the dinner. Tell the emperor he can send as many reprimands as he pleases. I'll be glad to accept. As we discuss the possibility of imposing sanctions on Azerbaijan, we need to pay attention to its practical influence over the behavior of the Azerbaijani government. Otherwise, those measures will be no different than the reprimand of the Russian Emperor to Ibrahim Khan. I have several points to make to contribute to our discussions, in line with what we in AZAD have been discussing about the ongoing crisis with the Azerbaijani government's human rights abuses. Azerbaijani government under Ilham Aliyev has been consistent in what it has been doing throughout all these years since 2003. In a time span of 11 years, Ilham Aliyev's regime has been consistently pushing this small post-Soviet country from an authoritarian political system, which was inherited from Heydar Aliyev, to an almost totalitarian system, where there is no place for any contested elections, where there is no place for any viable opposition party, where there is no place for the presence of any international organization doing any kind of meaningful civic development work, where there is no tolerance for any independent journalism, where there is no tolerance even for any independent lawyers who dare to represent the imprisoned human rights activists and jailed journalists. Unlike the Azerbaijani government, the Western democracies, including the US, have been pretty inconsistent in dealing with the dictatorial regime of Ilham Aliyev in Azerbaijan. While voicing growing concern over the dramatic changes in the political landscape of the country, Azerbaijan and the Azerbaijani government have generally been viewed as an ally, and not just as an ally, but as an ally of strategic importance. Azerbaijan does not sell any oil or gas to the United States, and its oil gas supplies provide for a tiny portion of the energy demand of the Western Europe. This entire strategic ally rhetoric is intentionally promoted by the paid lobbyists of the Azerbaijani government. As a result, a narrative has been formed that Azerbaijan is indeed a strategic ally of the United States. The importance of Azerbaijan as a strategic ally is also being pushed as a part of the reasoning that Azerbaijani government's cooperation is needed to deter the growing ambitions of Putin's Russia in the region. This line of reasoning ignores a simple fact that the geopolitical fight between the West and Russia is pretty much the fight between freedom and dictatorship. Russia invaded Georgia because it could not digest the democratic government of that country. Russia invaded Ukraine because the Ukrainian people overthrew the authoritarian government of Yanukovych and attempted to re-establish the Ukrainian democracy. The dictatorship in Azerbaijan, as much as it poses itself as a Western ally, is a Russian turf. Hence, Ramiz Mehdiev's rhetoric, anti-Western rhetoric. During the past several months, the Azerbaijani government officially shut down and expelled the remaining few US civil society institutions from the country. And yet, the narrative dominant in the US establishment continues viewing the Aliyev government as a strategic ally. Buying into this narrative has consequences. Being strategic ally means being indispensable. And the Aliyev regime, confident with being an indispensable partner of the United States, is acting with impunity to create a new Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan without opposition, without free speech, and without any meaningful civic activism. Another consequence of the strategic ally narrative is that a new narrative is being formed in Azerbaijan, according to which the United States, by buying into this narrative of Azerbaijan being a strategic US ally, is also buying into tacitly supporting the atrocities of the Aliyev regime, that the United States has agreed to the remodeling of Azerbaijan to make it look more like the Saudi regime, that the deep concerns expressed by the US officials over the continuing arrests and prison abuses of Azerbaijani journalists, political and civic activists are nothing more than face-saving measures not aimed at deterring the Azerbaijani government in any way. Senator Ben Cardin, by far the most vocal friend of human rights and political liberties in Azerbaijan, if to compare his record with the records of other US senators and congressmen, called Azerbaijan a friend and an important strategic partner of the United States twice during the past several months amidst the tremendous crackdown of the Azerbaijani government on the civil society in the country. In an interview to the Radio Liberty at the end of June and in an interview to the Voice of America just a few weeks ago. The Radio Liberty interview from Mr. Cardin was taken by Khadija Ismail, who is now in jail. In both interviews, Mr. Cardin criticizes the appalling human rights records of the Azerbaijani government and yet beautifully calls the Azerbaijani government an important strategic partner whose friendship is valued by the United States and to whom the United States government is thankful for its partnership in the energy and security fields. The question is, what is the deterrent value of the demands to free the jailed journalists and civic activists? What is the deterrent value of the deep concerns expressed over the atrocities of the Azerbaijani government if they are expressed together with praising and thanking this very regime for its friendship and partnership? The United States government under various administrations have been consistent, emphasizing that the United States attaches equal priorities to energy cooperation, security cooperation, and the cooperation in the sphere of human rights in its Azerbaijan policies. And yet, the third consecutive US ambassador is being appointed to Azerbaijan with energy background. Mr. Matthew Bryson, who was coordinating the US energy policies in the Black Sea and Caspian region prior to his appointment to the position of the US ambassador to Azerbaijan, promptly picked up the position of a board member of Turkas Petrol, an affiliate of Azerbaijan state-owned company, upon finishing his term as the US ambassador to Azerbaijan. Prior to his appointment as ambassador to Azerbaijan, Mr. Richard Morningstar, the US ambassador who followed Mr. Bryson, served as the Secretary of State Special Envoy for Eurasian Energy. He just finished his term as the US ambassador this year and was named as the founding director of the newly established Global Energy Center of the Atlantic Council, an American think tank with lobbying ties to the Azerbaijani government. The named US ambassador to Azerbaijan, who is still in the confirmation process, Mr. Robert Chekuta, is the principal deputy assistant secretary for the State Department's Energy Resources Bureau. I don't want to be unfair to him by prognosing his post-service career without having hard facts. But this is the background against which different US officials continue expressing their growing and deep concerns over yet another arrest of an Azerbaijani journalist, political or civic activist. Khadija Ismailova, the prominent investigative journalist of the US media institution, she's a journalist of Radio Liberty, was arrested one day after the Foreign Relations Committee of the US Senate approved Mr. Chakuta's nomination as US ambassador to Azerbaijan. Discussing the possibilities of imposing meaningful sanctions against the Azerbaijani government is an effort to save the Azerbaijani civil society from the onslaught of the Aliyev regime. But it's also a challenge to test the sincerity of the US support for the democratic development in Azerbaijan. What can be done realistically to influence the Aliyev regime? Travel bans on the government officials engaged in human rights violations? Maybe. But we have also to be aware of the fact that not many government officials travel to the US, and imposing travel bans alone will have only a symbolic effect on the Azerbaijani government's behavior. Since the Aliyev regime is largely a kleptocracy with the senior officials moving large assets through Western banks, asset freeze is of course the most potent weapon to go after these officials. But can it be done? Starting earnest discussions around these issues can help not only to bring a normal government to Azerbaijan, but also help the US to earn a true strategic ally in the region, which, as David mentioned, shares the values of the Western liberal democracies and therefore cannot even contemplate switching sides to become an ally to Putin's Russia or the Mullah regime of Iran. Right now, the Western policies seem to be aimed at appeasing the Ilham Aliyev regime, which constantly blackmails the US and its European allies with switching sides and becoming a Russian ally. What an ally. Thank you.
We're going to go now to question and answer section. On the presenters table, there are two mics. If you can turn them on by pressing the sign until green light comes up, and the same on the mic. So please feel free to raise your hand and introduce yourself and ask your question. I would encourage to ask questions, not make statements. And just for the sake of keeping conversation going, let's keep to the subject in focus that the presenters talked about. So before going to Q&A, I also want to thank again our guest speakers for their excellent presentations on a much needed topic that had to be discussed, and I think, and my sincere gratitude for all presenters for making very valid points and also opening for us now in Q&A section an avenue for very interesting discussion. So please proceed with your questions. Irena?
I will be second. Should I have a microphone? So I will reformulate two of my points into questions. Question first. Don't you think that it's terribly depressing that as the situation in Azerbaijan worsens, we are meeting in such a small company about once a year? 10 years, 12 years ago, we used to have meetings on Azerbaijan very often, organized by different organizations. And there are always people representing the most important, not only the State Department, the Pentagon, and so on. So my question is, what happened? My second question is, don't you think it would make sense to have now either a meeting for voluntary appearance of all of the organizations which were giving grants to Azerbaijan for the last 20 years, and I don't have to mention, but things that we all know is USAID, NED, IRA, NDI, Solidarity Center, IREX, IFES, everybody was getting millions of dollars for promoting democracy in Azerbaijan, and wouldn't be good to either ask them, what did you do with this money, or if they don't want to answer, to ask the GAO to check it. And I'm very, very serious, because you are talking, you and Gorkhmaz, about the lobby. Yes, there is a lobby, and the lobby is being paid, Azeri lobby is being paid by the Azeri embassy, and we know it, and so on. But another lobby that I have seen in the last 20 years, not only the case of Azerbaijan, are the NGOs which get money for democratizations of country in which democratization is not going forward, but they still want more and more money. Please check, this is my question, could you check the NED grants for almost $1 million for Azerbaijan for issues like democracy, deficit in resource-rich areas, promoting civic activism, dialogue of reform. If all of those organizations came together, it's a question, don't you, and said, we are hopeless, we completely wasted the money since 2003, October 16, when Deputy Secretary Richard Armitage sent a message to Haidar Ilham Aliyev saying, you won, although you had a real coup d'etat instead of elections. From that time on, we should not have been giving those millions and millions, which not only go for corruption of NGO people, but also support the coffers of the government. So my question is, don't you think I have something clear to make sense?
Thank you. We'll take another question. I think that was a very well done job on reformulating into question. Well, thank you for very valid, interesting points. And Laura, please go.
Laura Jewett from NDI. I feel like I have to respond, and it won't be a question, it'll be a comment. I resent what you said, actually. There are a lot of organizations and NGOs that have been working in Azerbaijan in very, very difficult circumstances. I will speak for NDI. That money has not been going to the government. We have had to leave recently because it became impossible to work there. But among other things, we were working very hard to try to support EMDS in the very courageous work that they did in observing the elections, and for which they went to prison.
It's actually one, okay, but it's a different discussion. So I propose a real discussion of people working in Azerbaijan, which we did also on the elections, and to discuss which, what made sense and which was a...
I just think it's not particularly constructive to focus on criticizing the groups that have been working very hard to support human rights and democracy.
I also support, I criticize organizations who go for millions of dollars to keep offices, and the results are not being put.
But I think we will give a chance to presenters to respond to the question. And I would like to add a small comment that it is more people at these meetings would have been more encouraging. So it's kind of something our organization probably also needs to do a better job of conducting these events more often. So just wanted to make that comment. I'll let presenters to respond.
One thing I do think would be
You should press and hold it.
One thing I do think would be useful is to get the NGOs together who have this very rich experience, as well as those Azerbaijanis who are available to benefit from it, and talk about what do we do now? Because we can't, we're not going to be able to go back to the 1990s and do the same things we did the way that we did them. But it's time to be very creative about reestablishing those connections between people of Azerbaijan and groups outside Azerbaijan who are concerned about the same things. Like I said, I asked the question without having an answer, but that has to be an immediate step.
I would say, Irina, that the problem isn't with the Western American NGOs. They have worked under tremendously difficult circumstances. The head of one, in fact, was killed over a decade ago. And others have been forced to flee. Ken Pollock, in fact, who was traveling there, developed a terrible medical situation, but he was going to try to salvage what he could for NDI. I don't think it's, I agree with Rich completely that at this time, it would be very useful for the NGOs, whether under your umbrella or someone else's, to gather peer notes, learn lessons. The problem isn't with us, in the NGO world. The problem's over there, the government, that is going after not only their own citizens, but workers from NDI, NED, IREX, others. There's been lots of money spent in many places where we haven't seen results we hoped for, but it isn't the lack of trying, or it isn't about the integrity of the organizations involved, I would say.
I would just add, I think there's always room to look at the effectiveness of organizations that are working in countries like Azerbaijan, and there are always questions to ask about strategies of how one works in a country that's as authoritarian as Azerbaijan. But I think Ukraine is an excellent example of a place where the situation never got as bad as Azerbaijan is now. But there were times that have been very authoritarian, and when there have been rollbacks, and where it was very difficult to see what impact international democracy assistance was having. But when the breakthrough happens, all of the people who have been receiving NED funds, who've been working with IRI, who have been liaising with Freedom House, those people come to the forefront, and we see that now the fruits of those efforts become evident when the crackdown is no longer happening.
May I have a second? But I think I have to. Just very short. I propose that we have, maybe organized by you, a meeting on how different elections were going on in Azerbaijan, how the level of funding was increasing as the monitoring was decreasing. And I think that we should have started to have those meetings 10 years ago by organizations which were funding those processes.
I think we spoke enough on that subject. I'll use my moderator. I think it's a very interesting subject about what to do, but I see other people raising questions. Wendy, back.
Hi, Wendy Silverman with the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, DRL for short. I wanted to go back to a question that Ambassador Kauzlarich asked at the very end, but did not answer. Although perhaps former Assistant Secretary Kramer addressed it, I'd like to sort of encourage a more fulsome discussion. And that has to do with the question of, would sanctions work, and would they do more harm than good? And I think it would be helpful to frame this discussion in terms of what is driving the government of Azerbaijan's restrictions. My understanding is that they fear domestic instability. Now, our perspective, of course, is that domestic instability is, or domestic stability, is best enhanced through increasing respect for fundamental freedoms. They, however, have a different perspective, and I wonder what your thoughts are, both of you, on how we can address the root of the problem, which is conceptually, the government seems to have a very different conceptual framework of how a government goes about achieving long-term stability. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question. We're going to take them in pairs immediately in the second row.
Hi, Miriam Latswani. I also trying to figure out how to rephrase my comment as a question. The assault that's going on against civil society in Azerbaijan right now is trying to say that these people are corrupt, that these people are spies, that they're a fifth column, and so forth. And it's extremely disappointing for me to hear thoughts like that even brought up here, and at a time when people are being charged, very good people are being charged in spurious charges of mismanaging their grants. It's not productive for NGOs and people in the democracy community to be attacking one another. Mehdiev's missive names specific people in the NGO community and tries to connect them to some kind of financial issues. And before we get into any of that, we have to be extremely careful as we do it. One of the dangers that I wanted to maybe ask you about, whether you also see this as a problem, is the possibility of this repeating itself throughout the region. And I worry very much that the kinds of things that we've seen many times in the media, in Russian propaganda and spreading on various websites and so forth, that these people are spies, that they're corrupt, Western institutions, if these cases go to trial and they're actual court decisions, that puts that propaganda at a completely different level and can be used all over the region. And I worry very much in both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan that is considering now foreign agent type legislation that, and in Russia itself, I wonder if people are tried and there are actual materials of a case that can be used to grant greater legitimacy to the kinds of propaganda that's out there, how that could be used throughout the region. So I would just add that as potentially another reason, you know, in addition to the other piece is that there's a political problem with democracy and all of that, but there's also tremendous humanitarian concerns. So there's also a very strong humanitarian argument for several, not just labor, there's other prisoners as well who clearly are in serious health issues. So there's so many levels. There's a humanitarian, there's a political situation in Azerbaijan itself, and then I think there's regional implications.
Thank you. I think we'll give a chance for presenters to respond.
Wendy, I don't have a good answer for your question, but you know, I think one of the issues is it's hard to talk to a government that just isn't communicating in the same way. I mean, it was one thing in Georgia where you know, Saakashvili was, you know, for all his warts, was someone you could really engage in a discussion of a lot of these issues. Azerbaijan, I don't know who you would go to. And therefore, I think we need to think of new ways of reaching out to civil society organizations such as they exist in Azerbaijan and maybe in the region to work from third countries where we could do things that we couldn't do in Azerbaijan and bring people out. The other thing I think in terms of sanctions, whether they do more harm than good or Ilham cares about his image, and I think the Euro Olympics is a good example of that. You know, if there is something that doesn't allow him to realize that objective, that's more likely to get him to pay attention to us than, you know, another diplomatic demarche. I just think that we've seen that, you know, trying to engage with this government on a normal basis just simply doesn't work because they don't share our values that we're trying to impress on them.
I think, Wendy, the problem is it gets at the nature of the regime. Authoritarian kleptocracies, by definition almost, will resort to any measures necessary in order to stay in power. And those measures to you and me and others here may seem counterproductive and run the risk of blowing up on them, but to them, they don't know any other means. Rule of law, transparency, accountability are all foreign, alien concepts to them. And cracking down is what they know best. It's what they resort to. So their recipe or way forward for long-term stability, I think, is just polar opposite from what we think, in part because they can't afford to relinquish power. In our systems, transitions of power are a normal part of our societal development, political development. In their systems, relinquishing power means probably winding up in jail, if not worse. And so we have to get at some of the root causes that you were rightly asking about. And I think part of it is it's a country that lacks democratic institutions, political parties, despite the great work that has been tried, because it's a kleptocratic, authoritarian system. with a very small circle. And as you were pointing out, Rich, at the beginning, the wealth that it encountered or has enjoyed by a small group means there's a lot at stake here, and they don't want to relinquish that. Miriam, on your question, I think absolutely. I would actually point the finger, though, more at Russia as the model and the enabler than at Azerbaijan and the other countries in the region. And if you think back in particular to, what was it, 2005, I think, the NGO law in Russia that was first being considered. And there, actually, the West did engage. In fact, I remember I was in the State Department at the time. We had a meeting bringing in, I think, MED and NDII, others, and had consultations about the best way to push back on it. And it got watered down. It was still bad, but it got watered down. But I think Russia, and that legislation, by the way, was, as you know, a model not just for the region, but globally. We've seen it explode in places like Ethiopia, Jordan. Kenya's been considering it, the more recent NGO legislation in Russia. So I think just by its size, by its dominant role in the region, Russia does tend to play this role. However, some of the countries that follow that model can overfulfill the quota, if you will, and get carried away in terms of what they do, and go to even more extreme measures if they think they are vulnerable or at risk. So I think it's a huge problem. I agree with you, and you're also absolutely right to note the humanitarian interests in many other prisoners whose release we need to see.
Before we go to the
Let me
set of questions, go ahead.
Just to add, I think your point about the potential of this broadening in other parts of the world really goes back to the point that I was making as well. We need to think about different ways of delivering our values, not to the exclusion of the traditional patterns, but there's got to be another way, because they're not going to let us do what we've done in the past.
Before going to the next round, I wanted just to also add a little bit in terms of the problem, what's going on in the countries like Azerbaijan and in Central Asia and in Russia too. There is no doubt that Western NGOs, and especially people working with them, are under attack. And we can't deny people going to prison. And the Gorkhmaz touched upon our organization's view. We see a problem not because there's a lack of desire by Western NGOs and their local representatives to do something. I think there is a lack of, on a much higher level, of the US government and general policy support, where we have the promotion of democracy, where we have dedicated organizations on the ground, but at the same time, for the reasons that Gorkhmaz mentioned, in some countries there might not be enough state backing, and we see where people are going to jail and the governments feel the impunity of actually attacking not just local opposition, but also Western NGOs at the ground. Next round of questions
I'm going to take the liberty of not asking questions, since I'm going to be raising an issue that's not been mentioned at all. Some of you will not be surprised that I'm going to talk about freedom of religion, but the majority of the 100 prisoners in Azerbaijan were there because they violated, or allegedly violated, the very restrictive Azerbaijan law on religion. Back in late April, my organization, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, published the names and specifics of 50 religious prisoners in Azerbaijan, and wrote a very critical chapter about the religion law and the effect it's had inside the country. So in connection with that, I think there's some very specific, if not sanctions, then policy responses that can be undertaken. One of them is, well, first of all, I should also say that most of us know that the Azerbaijani government is very happy to proclaim itself as the head of a very tolerant government. and the tolerant society for which it claims all the credit. But of course, if one looks under the fig leaf of that comment, I think one can see that government policies, which were liberal until about 2009 or so, have retreated from that in a very decisive and unfortunate fashion. Now, as to specific policy vehicles, I'd like to mention several. One is that the OSCE representative in Azerbaijan has been, shall we say, extremely cooperative with the Azerbaijani government in organizing very high-level religious tolerance conferences. There was one, I believe it was last month. I happened to have attended a previous such conference and noted that it was quite remarkable in the sense that it got extremely high-level religious representatives from Egypt, from various countries, but no local representatives, or practically no local activists were represented there, let alone any local concerns. So I think it might be worthwhile to put some pressure on the OSCE project director in country. As I understand it, our US OSCE ambassador has done so. He publicly said at this religious meeting, conference on religion, I should say, that this representative should represent the interests of the OSCE, not that of the government of Azerbaijan. There's also US law called Country of Particular Concern, which if a government has consistently violated freedom of religion, not only in its laws, but also in its policies, and I think 50 religious prisoners certainly testifies to that, and in fact the number may be larger since it's changed somewhat since April. But I do think that that's a specific policy option we should undertake. And finally, I wanted to mention another totally, as the Russians would say, from another opera kind of mechanism that exists also, called politically exposed persons list, which is a list maintained by Western banks of particularly gross violators of human rights, particularly corrupt officials, and Western banks thereby, if an individual or official, or I think it's limited to individuals and officials, is on that list, Western banks are served notice that they accept funds from those individuals only at great risk. I don't know the technical financial term for that, but some of you may have. Anyway, I did want to add this, and I apologize for going on a bit. Thanks.
Thank you. Question in front, then we'll go to the second.
Ramesh Yunus. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Mr. Kramer and Mr. Ambassador Kauzlarich, for your statement. My name is Ramesh Yunus. More people know me, but let me introduce Arif and Leila Yunus is my member of my family, now in jail. And I'm former Chief of Staff of Government and former Chief of Staff of Parliament of Azerbaijan. Now I got political asylum in the United States. Now I'm American citizen, and I'm proud to be American citizen. More question and no answer. More questions, no answer. Because everybody asking about new direction. But first of all, how David Kramer is mentioned is about Olympic Games. Today, more 100 people in jail. First of all, this is problem. Then is we have to thinking about strategy, how we can talk about our direction. Ilham Aliyev every day thinking about his image. You have to understand, I'm former Chief of Staff. I have a two vision. Like Azeri citizen, like American citizen. My question to both of you, because your vision inside, I can see from there also. And Ilham Aliyev thinking about his image. He used always Eurovision 2012. Next year will be Olympic Games, first Olympic Games. $8 billion is big money for small Azeri country. In Sochi, Putin spent 50 billion. You know how Putin, after Sochi invasion in Ukraine. Same things in Azerbaijan, 8 million. West, United States, your allies in Europe, we give this chance for Ilham Aliyev. If we give him chance, we cannot boycott, we cannot stop at this one, but we have to push it in. We know how we have to push it our allies in Europe. I don't know how. It's my question for both of you, because you're working inside the government. And now it's live coverage. Everyone in Azerbaijan can see, and everyone asking, because the place is empty. Pro-Western place, people who is protect always pro-Western values in Azerbaijan is empty, include my family member. My question for you is, give your advice inside what's happened again for our understanding, how we can work with US government, how we can work with United States public opinion, how we can push it this one, how we can change the situation. I don't know how, because everyone asks me give advice, but I ask you give our advice also, people inside.
We will pass to the next question now, and I really encourage, please ask questions and please keep them short. We have limited time right now and we're trying to cover. So it would be second row and first row here. We're going to take 3 questions at a time and then pass.
Yes, I wanted to get back to the question of would sanctions be harmful or hurtful? To me it seems that when our government states that we are defending human rights and we're going to impose sanctions, that's a good thing. There may be some harmful things that happen as a result, because the government that we're imposing sanctions on is a harmful government, not because we don't impose sanctions. And what I would like to ask is, shouldn't we think about imposing sanctions, since it's so hard to impose sanctions, as David knows? Shouldn't we be talking about a sort of comprehensive thing? Because when I've looked at the sanctions question, it's always been effective when there's been comprehensive sanctions for a determined and strategic policy. For example, Poland. For example, South Africa. For example, Chile. All 3 successes in which countries changed to democratic regimes because there was a strategic outlook and an overall purpose. And just one thing, just one point. It doesn't seem to me to be counterproductive to propose that we look at the effectiveness of 20 years' work of democracy promotion in Azerbaijan, and to see in this situation now what's
I'll encourage again. Please keep to the question. I think we went over that subject effectively, and today we're discussing topic of sanctions. We have a separate event on that specific topic, and without any disrespect, I think it's a very valid topic what to do, but we can probably try to cover the main subject. I think first row here, and then.
I have a recommendation of following up on something you said, David, about the concern that is frequently expressed about pushing Azerbaijan into the arms of Russia. And Gorkhmaz and Elmar, you would know this much better than I, but for many years there has been a battle among various factions within the government, various clans and factions, for ascendancy or for control of the government. As far as I understand, Ramiz Mekhtiev represents the Russian wing of the government of Azerbaijan, and he is, as far as I can tell, firmly in control. So Azerbaijan has already gone into the arms of Russia. So we should just stop worrying about that issue, take it off the table. And I guess I would just propose that as a response to people who express the concern that issue is already over.
I think we'll give chance for the presenters to respond, and then we'll start with me.
Well, you know, what can we tell the U.S. government to do that they haven't already thought about doing? I think it's, you know, there are a lot of smart people, many of them in this room, you know, who have been Wendy being one of them, who've been on this this issue for a number of years. It's not as if there's a rock out there that we need to uncover. The question is, you know, are we going to get beyond simply expressing concern and do something that does have an impact on either the leadership or on individuals within Azerbaijan who are responsible for the arrest and prosecution of the people that we're most concerned about? I would go back to the question that I started with. What can the U.S. government do to cause the government of Azerbaijan to release the individuals that are now being held in prison? That really, you know, it's a question of, you know, increasing the pressure, being strategic about sanctions. You don't start with full Iran, North Korea kind of approaches. You make it clear to the government what you expect them to do, and then hold them to that, either in terms of timing, and if that doesn't happen, then go to the next stage. You have to be very, very strategic about it. But it's not as if there's a mechanism out there that people aren't already aware of. They're aware of travel controls that can be used in other cases. The Venezuelan example is a perfect example of where you have asset implications as well as travel controls embodied. But I think, you know, if I were to advise the U.S. government, it is, we're in a different place now. You need to sit back and do an assessment of how do we go forward post-December 3. Because we can't continue to operate as we did before. That would be my advice. Let's see. I guess I can cover the sanctions part.
Just picking up on that last point that Rich made, I think that both of us worked in the government. There's a tendency in the U.S. government, for those of you who are part of the government, to have short-term thinking, getting through the immediate, the crisis, and there isn't a lot of time to think beyond that. But I think in the case of Azerbaijan, we do need to think about the positions we've had, the positions we're taking now, the positions we will take vis-a-vis the people of Azerbaijan. The worst outcome, the worst scenario, I would think, is for the U.S. to be associated with a regime that, if it is changed, is very unpopular, and we get blamed for having propped it up. I'm not saying that's true, but I think it's a concern we need to think about. On the Olympics, they're next June. They're not far away. So if we're going to do something, either as a community, we've got to get moving. The Sochi campaign started a year before. And the Sochi campaign had some limited effectiveness. I don't want to exaggerate it. There was a particular focus on the LGBTI legislation in Russia that was passed. I think that campaign did help. It prevented problems, at least on that issue. But at the end of the day, Sochi was viewed by Putin as a huge success. I think we need to focus on the political leaders who might attend. I think we also need to focus on the sponsors. It's the sponsors who really do care about their image. And if we tell them, do you really want to be sponsoring Azerbaijan's hosting of these Olympics? Aren't you worried about your image? That might have some impact. On sanctions, on Eric's question, I go back to the experience I had with Belarus in 2006 to 2008, where the US and EU initially imposed sanctions against the Lukashenko regime for the terrible election in 2006, but also for the imprisonment of a number of political activists and political figures. The ratcheting up of sanctions that the US did in November 2007 was done unilaterally without the EU, because we knew the EU didn't have an appetite for more sanctions, and it was done with the explicit message of release of the political prisoners. It wasn't turn Belarus into a democracy. It was let these people out of jail. 2 months later, the release of the political prisoners began. It took several more months for Alexander Kazulin to get released, but there's no question in my mind, based on information I used to be able to read, that the imposition of additional sanctions by the United States secured the release of those political prisoners. Kazulin is convinced of it. what the U.S. did got him out of jail. Unfortunately, too late for him to attend his wife's funeral. So it seems to me that at a minimum, sanctions should be imposed unless and until political prisoners are released and rehabilitated. That's where I think more recently the US and EU have let down the cause in Belarus, which is there have been releases of political prisoners. There are still about 6 or 7 left. None of them has been rehabilitated. And that should be a demand of ours. On Laura, your point on the Russia, I agree completely. We need to stop formulating policy and thinking about countries through another country's prism. We need to deal with the country that we're talking about, in this case, Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan borders Russia. It's in Azerbaijan's interest to have good relations with Russia. Azerbaijan borders Iran. It's in a tough neighborhood, but we need to focus on what's happening inside the borders of Azerbaijan. And what's happening inside the borders, as we all know in this room, is alarming. I agree completely. Let's just stop worrying about this. It's a card that the Aliyev regime throws out. They let them play it. Let them play it as much as they want. We shouldn't get into that game, in my opinion.
I'm going to take 2 last questions already over. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one point. If we get into a position where we are thinking strategically about releasing political prisoners and next steps, I think you have to not fall into a trap where you have to pay something for the release of the prisoners. I mean, there's going to be the expectation, and we've seen it already on a smaller scale, that somehow, if I release 15, I'll get a free pass to the Euro Olympics or something like that. This has to be very intentional and very clear that this is not, we're not in a bargaining situation here. This is a decision that Azerbaijan took, independent of the U.S., to put itself in a bad way with both us and our Western friends. They have to correct it if they really want an improved relationship. But no, we're not going to reward you for releasing people who shouldn't have been in prison in the first place.
Yeah, I think we're going to take last 2 questions. And we're going to...
I was going to ask about
Said, and please keep questions to a minimum. We're over time right now, so we will be...
I will try to be as quick as possible. I would like to compare current situation in Azerbaijan back to 2005 briefly. Then in 2005, I was arrested. We were arrested first time on accusations overthrow the government. We had way more support than current political prisoners have now. I personally had at that time 3 lawyers at one moment. OSCE representative came meet with me in hospital. They helped me as a hostage. U.S. Ambassador Rino Harnish had met with officials about that. State Department statements was way stronger than this, and we got way more better support. But last time when I was in Azerbaijan and they banned my exit, I couldn't find lawyers simply because there was only few lawyers left who would represent the activists, human rights defenders who are in jail right now, and all of them overloaded these cases. It took me 3 days. It took some of my friends asking people and to represent me, just simply to represent me during the interrogation. And when I went to U.S. Embassy, I don't want to criticize State Department, but when I went to U.S. Embassy, they didn't have any idea what to do. You don't think this is sent a wrong message to people in Azerbaijan? You don't think we are losing hearts and minds over there? People now start thinking, because I was following what's people reaction, ordinary people reaction, not these famous bloggers, inner circles, out of these inner circles. I was following the reaction, and United, as United States, we became kind of joke over there. Now same thing happened with Khadija Ismailova case. She worked for Radio Free Europe, and only our reaction on James Psaki level. I'm sorry, but that's disappointing. And 2 days ago, Senator Ted Cruz, on his speech, mentioned that because of our weak foreign policy, our enemies don't afraid us and our allies don't respect us. You don't think this is all part of this?
Thank you, and we're going to take one last question, and that will be next one.
Thank you. So my question goes back to like possible repercussions.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, my name is Don McCullough, and my question goes to like the possible repercussions of sanctions and how if the sanctions did in fact cripple the regime and spark some sort of political unrest, how committed do you think the United States would be to like trying to rebuild that? Because as we've seen, as like what happened in Iraq and Syria and the influence of ISIS and that crisis that's now happening, like there are problems when like even if they are corrupt or bad regimes crumble, it creates a power vacuum, and sometimes, in some cases, worse people can come in and fill the void. So, do you think that that is certainly influencing the United States' decision on whether or not to implement sanctions? Then also on a separate note, sorry, I know you told me to be brief, but to try and get more people here, you might want to try using a bigger net. Like right now, just focusing on Azerbaijan, I didn't even know Azerbaijan existed until 5 years ago. So like you're probably not going to turn a lot of heads when you talk about Azerbaijan having problems. But if you make the focus more on human rights in general and try and get a big room full of people that are concerned about human rights and then direct their attention to the issues that are happening in Azerbaijan, you might get like more people involved.
Thank you. Point well taken. I will let the presenters to respond.
I want to be very clear. When I'm thinking about sanctions and why I'm here today, I'm thinking about how do you secure the release of people who are being held in Azerbaijan. I am not here to bring down the regime. That's not what this is about. And so when you talk about sanctions, they're with a very specific target in mind, with a very specific objective. You know, you do need another meeting if you're going to get in. I mean, you've raised some very interesting questions about the impact of sanctions and negative consequences of it. But, you know, the U.S. reaction, I don't know why we say what we do what we do. I just, I can't explain why it was different in 2005 than it is today. But consistency isn't necessarily a virtue of foreign policy if you say the same thing over and over again. There may be other things going on that I'm just simply not aware of. But RFERL, VOA, Hajj's role as a journalist, all of those things go into what ought to be a very strong sense of concern on the part of the U.S. government about freedom of expression. How we get that across, that's another story, and who's the best person to deliver it. But it goes back to Wendy's question, does it make a difference if people on the other side really don't care about doing anything to change?
But we send a message to people, because we lose the ground over there. We lose the hearts and minds. People say, oh, the United States don't care about the values.
Well,
people saying in social media, I'm following up on former U.S. Ambassador Richard Morningstar became a joke. He had so many anecdotes about him.
Well,
I think we'll David respond to.
Yeah, I mean, Said, I think you were there, if I recall correctly, after Dick had left the embassy, his tour had ended. Overall, I think he did a very good job. The problem I think he faced and others have faced is a lack of attention and interest back in Washington. There needs to be higher level attention paid to the challenges and problems that are occurring in Azerbaijan. This was true in the Bush administration. It is true in the Obama administration. Unfortunately, there is bipartisan responsibility for a lack of sufficient attention to what's happening, and it includes the Congress. And this is where the issue of lobbyists and others get into the mix because of their impact. There's a lot of money sloshing around this city from Azerbaijan as well as from Russia, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere. But overall, I think, despite his energy background and where he's going next. I think Dick did a very good job. You wound up there at a time when there wasn't an ambassador, and Rich knows much better than I do. When you don't have an ambassador, Chargé can be the best person in the world, but he or she lacks the title. And in a place like Baku, as you know better than I do, titles matter. On the sanctions, we have to be careful here. Sanctions are not the fault. Sanctions are a response to what a regime is doing to its own people. And sanctions won't be imposed if a government treats its own people with respect. So it's the Putin regime's treatment of its own people, the Lukashenko regime's treatment of its own people, maybe hopefully soon the Aliyev regime's treatment of its own people that would trigger sanctions. As Rich said, not designed to bring down the regime, designed to bring about a change in the regime's behavior. That may be wishful thinking. And as I was responding to Wendy's question, the nature of the regime is such that it may not be changeable. But I think if you start denying them access, but more importantly, go after their assets so that they can't have property in the Gulf and elsewhere and put their money in the West, that might get their attention. So I would certainly be willing to give that a try. As I said, it got political prisoners out of Belarus in 2008, and there was a lot less Belarusian government money in the West than there is Azerbaijani regime money. And so I think it is very important. The last point I would make is when the US and or the EU decide to take steps, it then triggers a much bigger reaction. It has a huge impact on investor confidence. Look at Russia, where investors lose confidence in doing business in Russia because they're worried about doing business with sanctioned entities. And so if the West were to take steps against Azerbaijan, that would have significant repercussions in other areas that would magnify the impact of the sanctions beyond simply denying visas or seizing assets.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank both the presenters and the participants, and we kind of went over time. I think when it comes to Azerbaijan and what's going on there and effectiveness of US policy, I think there are too many problems on the ground and we have different views. So again, I'm just, sorry if somebody didn't get their view across or didn't have enough chance, but and sometimes question and answers can turn into very tough conversations. But I think I'm thankful that we had this discussion. I think this issue of what needs to be done and what are the consequences of Azerbaijani government ignoring all the concerns, that there has to be some consequences. That topic had to be raised. I appreciate it. Because we're over time, I don't think we have enough time for the video presentation. So we'll probably create a separate small event just for that, because we're for respect to everybody's time. But thank you and keep tuned. We will probably keep doing these events more often. That was one very well made point. Thank you.